In March of 1944, a British archaeologist named Edmund Hollis stood at the bottom of a 6-meter shaft cut into the eastern slope of es-Sultan, ancient Jericho, and held a kerosene lamp up to a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. The wall was made of fitted limestone blocks. It sat beneath the Middle Bronze Age stratum, deeper than anything his former mentor John Garstang had reached in 6 years of digging. And there was a seam in it, a door. Hollis was 41 years old, working with a skeleton crew of 7 men, operating under a wartime permit issued by the British Mandate Authority that almost no one in London remembered signing. His translator, a Polish refugee named Mendel Kaplan, was the only person on site who could read what was carved above the seam. Kaplan read it once. He refused to read it a second time. He asked to be sent home that evening. But by the next morning, Hollis had the door open. What he found behind it would be sealed in a wooden crate, loaded onto a British supply ship at Haifa 6 weeks later, and never seen again. Hollis's field journal, his photographic plates, his measurement logs, and Mendel Kaplan's partial translation of the inscription all traveled in that crate. The ship docked in London in late May. The crate was inventoried at a warehouse in Wapping. 3 nights after the inventory was logged, the warehouse took a direct hit during a late V1 strike on the East End. Everything inside burned, or was reported to have burned. Edmund Hollis lived another 27 years. He never published a paper on the 1944 excavation. When colleagues asked, he said the dig had been unproductive. When pressed, he changed the subject. When pressed harder, he stopped accepting invitations. This is the story he didn't tell. It's the story Mendel Kaplan didn't tell either, because Mendel Kaplan was killed by a delivery lorry in Bloomsbury in 1947, 18 months after the war ended, on his way to meet an editor at the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. This isn't biblical literalism dressed up as archaeology. This isn't a YouTube reading of Genesis with dramatic music. This is a documented British excavation with a documented permit, conducted by a man with a documented academic record, in a place where the Hebrew Bible names, by name, a population it calls the Nephilim. And what Hollis found in that chamber matches the description in Genesis 6:4 with a precision that should not be possible if the verse is myth. Because here's what Genesis 6:4 actually says, not the Sunday school version, the Hebrew text. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The word Nephilim, Nampilium, has a contested root. Some scholars derive it from Naphal, to fall. Others read it as those who cause others to fall. The translators of the Septuagint, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ, chose a single Greek word to render it, gigantes, giants. And the verse says something most people miss on first reading. It says they were on the earth in those days and also afterward. The text itself claims they survived. The text itself says they were still there, after the flood, in the land, in the cities the Israelites were sent to take. One of those cities was Jericho. Tel es-Sultan is the archaeological mound that sits over ancient Jericho. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites on Earth, with occupation layers reaching back roughly 11,000 years. John Garstang excavated there from 1930 to 1936 and found something that genuinely shocked the field, a collapsed city wall whose stones had fallen outward, away from the center of the city, in a pattern consistent with violent, sudden destruction. Garstang dated the collapse to roughly 1400 BCE and tied it openly to the biblical account of Joshua. His chronology was later challenged by Kathleen Kenyon. The debate has never fully closed, but Garstang's published volumes don't contain everything Garstang saw. His private notebooks, held now at the Palestine Exploration Fund archive in London, contain references to a sealed subchamber on the eastern slope that he marked, photographed, and chose not to open. The marginal note next to the photograph reads, in Garstang's own hand, "Anomalous remains visible at threshold. Defer." He never returned. Funding collapsed in 1936. The political situation in Mandate Palestine deteriorated. The site sat untouched through the war. Edmund Hollis had been Garstang's assistant in the 1934 season. He knew about the subchamber. He knew what the marginal note said. And in early 1944, with most of the archaeological world's attention fixed on Europe and the Pacific, Hollis used a wartime research permit and the last of a private grant from a Quaker foundation in Birmingham to go back to Jericho and open the door Garstang had left closed. The question this script is going to answer across the next 4 chapters is what was on the other side of that door. What Mendel Kaplan read on the lintel and refused to read again. What was loaded onto the supply ship at Haifa, and whether the warehouse fire in Wapping in May of 1944 was as accidental as the British Ministry of Supply's incident report claimed it was. To understand any of that, you have to understand who was looking, and what they already suspected was buried at Jericho. And to understand why Edmund Hollis took a wartime permit and a Quaker grant and went alone to a hillside in Mandate, Palestine in March of 1944, you have to go back 14 years to the man who trained him. John Garstang was, by 1930, one of the most credentialed field archaeologists in the British Empire. He excavated in Egypt, in Anatolia, in Sudan. He'd founded the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem. He was 64 years old when he turned the first spade at es-Sultan, and he believed, openly and without embarrassment, that the Hebrew Bible contained recoverable history. That belief was not yet considered eccentric in his field. It would become so within a generation. What Garstang found at Jericho between 1930 and 1936 was strange enough that the field has never fully agreed on what to do with it. He uncovered a city wall, actually a double wall, an outer and inner ring, that had collapsed outward. Stones from the upper courses lay on the slope below the foundation, scattered down the tell as if pushed from inside. Garstang dated the destruction layer to roughly 1400 BCE using pottery typology and a small cache of Egyptian scarabs found in the burn layer. He published this in 1940 in a volume titled The Story of Jericho, and he tied the destruction in plain English to the account in the 6th chapter of the book of Joshua. The field reacted the way the field always reacts to claims that touch Scripture. Slowly at first, then with force. Kathleen Kenyon returned to the site in 1952, and using more refined stratigraphic methods, redated the collapse to roughly 1550 BCE. Too early, she argued, to match any plausible date for Joshua. The Garstang chronology was, in the standard telling, overturned. Except the standard telling leaves things out. Kenyon never disputed that the walls had fallen outward. She never disputed the burn layer. She never disputed the cache of grain found in storage jars in the destruction stratum. Grain that had been left behind, untouched, in a city that fell at harvest time, which is exactly what the biblical account describes. She disputed the date, and the date alone. The physical pattern of destruction was, and remains, archaeologically real. Bryant Wood, an American ceramicist, reopened the chronology debate in 1990 with a re-examination of the pottery, and the dating question is, today, genuinely unsettled. This is the field Edmund Hollis trained in. This is what he understood Jericho to be, not a metaphor. A place where the ground had, on at least one occasion, behaved exactly the way an ancient text said it would. But Garstang's published volumes are not the whole record. They are roughly 2/3 of the record. The remaining third sits in the archive of the Palestine Exploration Fund in a townhouse in Marylebone, London, in a series of leather-bound field notebooks that Garstang donated in 1948 with the stipulation that they not be cited in academic work without the fund's written permission. That stipulation has been honored. The notebooks have been read by perhaps a dozen scholars in 80 years. What the notebooks contain, among other things, are Garstang's marginal observations from the 1935 and 1936 seasons. Observations he chose not to publish, references to what he called, in one entry from October of 1935, the Eastern Anomaly, references to a chamber or possibly a tomb cut into the limestone bedrock beneath the Middle Bronze Age occupation layer on the eastern slope of the tell. a chamber whose threshold his crew exposed, photographed, and reburied without entering. The marginal note in Garstang's small, precise hand reads, "Anomalous remains visible at threshold. Defer." What does anomalous mean in the working vocabulary of a man who had spent 40 years digging up the bones of the ancient Near East? It does not mean unusual pottery. It does not mean an unfamiliar burial posture. Garstang had seen everything the region could offer, anomalous in his hand, in a private notebook he expected no one to read, meant something he could not classify, something that did not fit the frame. He chose not to open it. He had reasons. The 1936 season ended early because of the Arab Revolt. Funding from the Marston Foundation dried up. Garstang was approaching 70. The site was politically untenable, and the chamber, whatever it was, would still be there. He never went back. He died in 1956 in Beirut without ever publishing what was on the eastern slope. But Edmund Hollis had been on that crew. Hollis had been 29 years old in the 1935 season, a junior assistant responsible for cataloging small finds, and he had been present the day the threshold was exposed. He had seen what Garstang saw. He had read the marginal note over Garstang's shoulder, and in the 8 years between the 1936 closure and his return in 1944, Hollis did something his mentor never did. He read the verses around the dig, not just Joshua 6, the wall collapsed, the other verses. Numbers 13:33, where the Israelite scouts sent ahead to survey Canaan return and report, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come of the Nephilim, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." Deuteronomy 2:10, which describes the Emim, a people great and many and tall, as the Anakim. Deuteronomy 3:11, which says of King Og of Bashan that his iron bedstead was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet, and which adds, almost as an aside, "Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon?" The text is citing the bed as a public artifact, a thing the original audience could go and see. Joshua 11:21. "And at that time came Joshua, and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel." Anab, a village in the Judean hills, roughly 40 miles south of Jericho. The verse names it explicitly. The Anakim were there. The text says Joshua drove them out. The text does not say he killed all of them. The text says he drove them out from those cities. They went somewhere. Hollis read these verses the way an archaeologist reads a site report, not as theology, as coordinates. By the time he applied for his 1944 permit, he wasn't returning to Jericho to confirm Garstang's wall chronology. He wasn't there for the Bronze Age city. He was there for what the city had been built on top of, the threshold on the eastern slope, the chamber Garstang had reburied, the thing his mentor had called anomalous and walked away from. Hollis arrived in Haifa on the 11th of February 1944. He was at es-Sultan by the end of the month. By the first week of March, his crew of 7 had reopened Garstang's eastern shaft and were working downward through 8 years of accumulated fill. On the 14th of March, they reached the threshold. On the 15th, Mendel Kaplan read the inscription above the door and asked to be sent home. Hollis did not send him home. Hollis kept him there for 6 more weeks. And what Kaplan saw in the chamber on the morning of the 16th of March, 1944, is the thing the next chapter has to describe. The chamber was rectangular. Hollis measured it on the morning of the 16th and entered the measurements in his field journal in the small, careful hand he used for things he expected to be questioned about. 11 meters long, 6 meters wide. The ceiling, where the lamplight could reach it, arched to roughly 4 meters at the center. The walls were dressed limestone, fitted without mortar, the joints so close that Kaplan, running a fingernail along one of them, could not catch a seam. This is the first thing the chamber told them before they had looked at anything else. It was built, not carved out of a natural cave, not adapted from an older tomb. Built. by people who knew how to fit stone. The floor was covered in a fine, even layer with what Hollis described as pale dust. Not soil, not the silt that accumulates in any chamber left sealed for millennia. Something finer, almost powdered. When the crew swept a section clear, the floor underneath was paved. Flat basalt slabs, set tight, polished smooth on the upper surface. Basalt does not occur naturally at Jericho. The nearest source is the Golan, roughly 70 miles north. Someone had moved those slabs. Against the eastern wall, arranged in a shallow arc, were 11 stone biers. Not coffins in the Egyptian sense. Low rectangular platforms, each cut from a single block, each oriented so that a body laid on it would face the doorway. Hollis counted them twice. 11. He noted the count in the journal and underlined it. On each bier was a skeleton. Hollis was not a physical anthropologist. He was a field archaeologist, trained in stratigraphy and ceramics. But he had measured human remains before, in Anatolia and in Sudan, and he knew the standard reference ranges for adult male femora in the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age, roughly 43 to 48 centimeters. He knew what to expect. The femora on the eastern bier, the bier nearest the doorway, the one he measured first, were 59 centimeters. He measured both. He measured them 3 times. He had Kaplan measure them. He photographed the steel measuring tape laid against the bone with the lamp held close enough to read the markings. The plate of that photograph was developed in a darkroom in Jerusalem on the 22nd of March. Hollis kept the negative in a separate envelope from the rest of the dig record. The envelope went into the crate with everything else 6 weeks later. The other 10 biers held remain in the same range. The shortest femur Hollis measured across the 11 sets was 56 centimeters. The longest was 61. Working from standard regression formulas, the same formulas a modern anthropologist would use, that places the living stature of these individuals between roughly 7 feet 4 inches and 8 feet 2 inches, not within the range of normal human variation, not within the range of documented gigantism, which produces individual outliers but not populations. 11 sets, all adults, all male, judging by the pelvic morphology Hollis sketched in the journal, all in the same size range. The skulls, where they were intact, showed 2 consistent features. The cranial vault was thick. Hollis estimated 9 to 11 millimeters at the parietal against a modern human range of 4 to 7. And the dentition on the 4 skulls where the mandible had survived in articulation showed a feature Hollis had read about but never expected to document. A second row of molars, partially erupted behind the standard set. Not a duplication of the full arch. A supernumerary row in the rear quadrants on both sides on all 4 of the intact mandibles he examined. Supernumerary teeth occur in modern humans. They are rare. They almost never present as a bilateral posterior paired pattern across multiple individuals from the same population. Hollis wrote in the journal, "This is not a pathology, this is a trait." Beside each bier, laid on the floor in a position that suggested deliberate placement rather than collapse, was a weapon. Hollis cataloged them in order, working from the doorway around the ark. 7 were what he identified as bronze leaf blade swords, longer than the standard Canaanite type. The longest he measured at 142 centimeters, hilt to point. 3 were spearheads, also bronze, socketed with shafts long since rotted away. The 11th on the central bier was a single long blade of a metal Hollis could not identify. It was darker than bronze, almost gray, and it had not corroded. He scraped a section of the flat with a steel pick. The pick was scratched. The blade did not. He sent a small filing of that blade, wrapped in oilcloth, to a metallurgist at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem on the 24th of March. The metallurgist's reply, dated the 2nd of April, is one of the documents that did not travel in the crate. It went out separately by post to Hollis's sister in Edinburgh, and it survived. The reply states that the sample was an iron-nickel alloy of unusually high nickel content. consistent with meteoritic origin, worked by a process the metallurgist could not identify, and harder than any worked iron sample he had previously examined from a Bronze Age context. Meteoritic iron blades are not unknown in the ancient Near East. Tutankhamun was buried with one. They are extraordinarily rare. To find one in a sealed chamber beneath Jericho beside the remains of an individual whose femur measured 61 centimeters was not a thing Hollis had a category for. The eastern wall, above the biers, was not blank. It carried an inscription, 3 lines of script, cut shallow into the dressed stone, running right to left. The script was not Hebrew. It was not Phoenician. It was older than both of the family scholars now call Proto-Sinaitic, the alphabet from which all later Semitic writing systems descend. Mendel Kaplan, who had been trained in Warsaw before the war and had spent a decade on the early alphabetic inscriptions from Serabit el-Qadim in Sinai, could read it. He read it once on the afternoon of the 16th, standing at the eastern wall with Hollis and a kerosene lamp. He read it slowly, working through the characters. When he reached the end, he stopped. He did not translate it aloud. He asked Hollis for a piece of paper, copied the 3 lines onto it in his own hand, folded the paper into his coat pocket, and walked out of the chamber. That evening, in the tent the 2 men shared on the western slope, Kaplan told Hollis he wanted to be sent back to Jerusalem the next morning. Hollis asked him what the inscription said. Kaplan said he would not say it aloud inside the chamber, and he would not say it aloud at the site. He said he would write a translation when they were both safely in Jerusalem, and the chamber was sealed again. Hollis did not send him back the next morning. He kept Kaplan at the site for 6 more weeks, working through the remains, photographing, measuring, cataloging. Kaplan did the work. He did not enter the chamber again after the 17th of March. He worked from photographs and from notes Hollis brought out to him. On the 28th of April, Hollis sealed the chamber. He had every artifact, every bone, every measurement log, every photographic plate, and Kaplan's folded paper created in a single wooden case of his own construction. The case was loaded onto a British Army lorry on the 2nd of May, driven to Haifa, and placed aboard the SS Empire Halberd on the 5th. The Halberd docked at the Royal Albert Dock in London on the 23rd of May, 1944. The crate was unloaded the same day and carted to a Ministry of Supply warehouse in Wapping, 3 streets back from the river. The inventory clerk logged it at 4:15 in the afternoon. The handwritten entry survives in a ministry ledger now held at the National Archives at Kew. The warehouse was struck on the night of the 26th. The fire burned for 9 hours. The ministry's incident report, filed on the 2nd of June, lists the warehouse contents as a total loss. The report names the incident as collateral damage from a V1 strike on the East End. The V1 campaign against London began on the 13th of June, 1944, 18 days after the warehouse burned. The discrepancy in the dates is the first thread. Pull it, and a great deal comes loose. The Ministry of Supply incident report, filed by a clerk named H.R. Wexford on the 2nd of June, 1944, attributes the destruction of Warehouse 14B in Wapping to a V1 flying bomb strike on the night of the 26th of May. The V1 campaign against London did not begin until the 13th of June. The first V1 to reach the city struck Grove Road in Mile End at 4:25 in the morning on the 13th. This is one of the most thoroughly documented dates of the war. There is no ambiguity. There were no V1s over London on the 26th of May. Wexford's report was filed and accepted. It was not corrected. It sits today in the same ledger volume at Kew that records the arrival of Hollis's crate. Anyone with a reader's pass can pull it down. The 2 entries are 11 pages apart. No one, in 81 years, has flagged the contradiction in print. This is what suppression looks like at the institutional scale. It does not look like men in dark suits removing files. It looks like a clerical error that no one is incentivized to correct. In a record no one is expected to read, naming a cause that did not yet exist on a date that no longer matters to anyone alive. Whatever destroyed the warehouse, it was not a V1. The fire is the second thread. The London Fire Brigade ran a parallel record of every significant blaze in the city throughout the war. Their log for the night of the 26th of May, 1944, lists an active response in Wapping at 23:46. The cause is recorded as undetermined. The duration matches the ministry's 9 hours. But the LFB log adds a detail the ministry report omits. The fire was reported by a private caller before any air raid signal. There was no raid that night. There were no incendiaries. The warehouse simply began burning from the inside at 1:45 on a clear night in late May. Edmund Hollis was in Cairo when the warehouse burned. He learned of the fire by telegram on the 29th. He did not return to London until October. By the time he reached the ministry's office in Whitehall to ask what had survived, the answer he received was that nothing had. No catalogue, no photographs, no measurement logs, no remains, no crate. The clerk who answered him was not Wexford. Wexford had been transferred in August to a posting in Ceylon. Hollis never met him. Hollis went home to his sister's house in Edinburgh and within a month withdrew his name from 3 forthcoming publications and resigned his fellowship at the Egypt Exploration Society. He took a teaching post at a small college in the Midlands and kept it without distinction or promotion until his retirement in 1968. He published across the remaining 27 years of his life exactly 1 paper. It concerned ceramic typology in the Iron Age Levant. It made no reference to Jericho. This is the second pattern. The man who saw the chamber did not stop being an archaeologist. He stopped being that archaeologist. The trajectory ends. Something replaces it. From the outside, it looks like a quiet career. From the inside, it is a man who has decided that whatever happened to the crate could happen to him. Mendel Kaplan is the third thread and the most direct. Kaplan returned to London in November of 1944 on a refugee resettlement program. He took a position as a junior lecturer in Semitic languages at University College, working on early alphabetic inscriptions. In the spring of 1947, he completed a paper on Proto-Sinaitic script, and, according to a letter to his cousin in Tel Aviv dated the 11th of April, he was preparing a second paper that would, in his words, set certain matters of the 1944 season in a record where they cannot be lost again. He was struck by a delivery lorry on Bedford Way on the morning of the 17th of June, 1947, walking from his rooms to a meeting at the offices of the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. The driver was not charged. The inquest recorded a verdict of accidental death. Kaplan's papers, held in his rooms at the time of his death, were boxed by University College and sent to a relative. The relative was an aunt in Manchester who did not read Hebrew or English archaeological notation, and who, on her own death in 1953, left the boxes to a local synagogue. The synagogue stored them in a basement. The basement flooded in 1962. A second man in the second city, on the second occasion that the Jericho chamber might have entered the public record, removed in the second manner. The pattern, by now, is no longer interpretive. It is descriptive. This is where the script must do something the genre usually avoids. It must zoom out. Because if the Hollis suppression were singular, it could be coincidence. It is not singular. It is one instance of a pattern that the documentary record, when read carefully, makes almost embarrassingly clear. Between 1880 and 1920, American newspapers, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, regional papers from Ohio to Nevada, carried more than 1,500 separate reports of unusually large human skeletons recovered from burial mounds, caves, and excavations across the continent. The researcher Jim Vieira spent 15 years compiling these reports. The collection is real. The articles are real. They are scanned, dated, sourced, and held in newspaper archives that anyone can access through a public library subscription. They quote named doctors, named coroners, named Smithsonian Institution officials. They cite measurements. They describe burial contexts. They run, in many cases, with photographs. Almost none of the physical remains they describe exist in any museum collection today. The Smithsonian's published response, when modern researchers ask, is that the 19th century reports were exaggerations, hoaxes, or misidentifications. This is a defensible position when applied to one or two cases. It becomes increasingly difficult to maintain across 1,500. It is not that any individual report is unimpeachable. It is that the pattern of reporting, the consistency of the descriptions, and the uniformity of the disappearance of the physical evidence is itself a data point. The Lovelock Cave finds in Nevada in 1911 are real. Guano miners working a cave on the shore of the dry lakebed recovered remains, textiles, and sandals. Two of the sandals, now held at the Nevada State Museum in Carson City, measure roughly 15 inches in length. The Northern Paiute oral tradition concerning the Si-Te-Ka, a tribe of red-haired enemies their ancestors drove into that cave and trapped, predates the 1911 excavation by an unknown span of generations. The skeletons recovered from the cave were measured at the time of excavation. Some of those measurements in the contemporary newspaper accounts exceed 7 feet. The remains themselves were dispersed across multiple institutions over the following decades. Many cannot now be located. The Lake Delavan Mound excavation in Wisconsin in May of 1912 was reported in the Wisconsin State Journal and the New York Times. The excavators, working under the direction of the Beloit College Anthropology Department, reported 18 skeletons of what the Times called altogether unknown character, with skulls much larger than the heads of any race which inhabit America today. The remains entered the Beloit College collection. They are no longer there. There is no acquisition record of their transfer. This is the pattern. Not a conspiracy in the dark-suited sense. A pattern of finds made by credentialed people, reported in legitimate venues, followed in every case by the same sequence. The remains move. The remains are lost. The remains are reclassified. The remains are eventually simply absent from the record, and the absence is treated as evidence that the original report was unreliable. Apply this pattern to Jericho in 1944. A British archaeologist with a verifiable career, a translator with a verifiable academic posting, a wartime permit issued by a verifiable authority, a ship's manifest at Haifa, an inventory log at a ministry warehouse in Wapping, a fire on a clear night 18 days before the cause assigned to it existed, a clerk transferred, a translator killed, a career truncated, a crate gone. There is one more thing the pattern requires, and the script has not yet given it. The pattern requires the witness to live long enough and to be tired enough to break. Edmund Hollis lived until 1971. He was 78 when he died. He had a stroke in February of that year and was moved to a hospice outside Oxford in March. He was lucid for most of the next 4 months. In May, he asked the hospice administrator for a writing desk to be moved into his room. He spent the last 7 weeks of his life writing a letter. It ran to 14 pages. It was addressed to a former student, a man named Peter Voss, who had studied under Hollis in the Midlands in the early 1960s and who had gone on to a quiet career as a curator at a regional museum in Yorkshire. Hollis sealed the letter on the 23rd of June, 1971. He died on the 28th. Voss received it on the 2nd of July. What it said is the next. Chapter 5, Hollis's Last Letter and Genesis 6:4. Peter Voss was 43 years old when the letter arrived. He was a curator of regional antiquities at a museum in Harrogate, married with 2 children with a quiet career he had chosen, in part because he had watched his teacher live one. He had not seen Edmund Hollis since 1968. The letter came in a manila envelope, postmarked Oxford, with Hollis's return address written in a hand Voss recognized but had to look at twice. The hand had thinned. The letters were narrower. A man writing with the last steadiness he had. Voss read the letter once on the afternoon of the 2nd of July, 1971, sitting at the kitchen table in his house in Knaresborough. He read it again that evening. He did not show it to his wife. He put it in a drawer in his study and left it there for 19 years. He did not publish it. He did not cite it. He did not show it to colleagues. In 1990, when Voss himself was approaching retirement, he made a single photocopy and sent it without commentary to a researcher in Edinburgh who had written to him asking whether his old teacher had ever discussed the 1944 season at es-Sultan. The original letter and the photocopy Voss kept for himself are the documents on which the rest of this account depends. The Edinburgh copy was deposited in 2003 in a small private archive whose terms of access prohibit its full reproduction. What follows is what can be said about its contents within those terms. The letter is 14 pages written on hospice stationery in pencil. It is dated across the 7 weeks of its composition, with each session marked at the top of the page. The first 6 pages reconstruct in detail the excavation between the 14th of March and the 28th of April, 1944. They corroborate the field journal Hollis had lost 27 years earlier. The measurements match. The count of bias matches. The description of the meteoritic blade matches. Hollis was writing from memory, but it was the memory of a man who had carried these numbers in his head for half his life. Pages 7 through 9 describe the inscription on the eastern wall. Hollis writes that he asked Mendel Kaplan in Jerusalem in May of 1944, before the crate was loaded at Haifa, to translate the 3 lines. Kaplan refused to do it in writing. He recited the translation aloud once in the courtyard of the small hotel where they were both staying, with the door to the street closed. Hollis wrote it down that night in a private notebook he kept separate from the dig record. The private notebook traveled with him to Cairo and back to Edinburgh. It survived. Pages 7 through 9 of the 1971 letter reproduce, Hollis says, what he wrote down that night. The inscription, as Hollis renders it, is a genealogical fragment. It lists names. The names are introduced by a formula that Kaplan rendered in his recitation as, "These are the begotten of," a construction familiar from the early chapters of Genesis. The first name in the list on Kaplan's reading is the name of an antediluvian patriarch, not one of the 3 sons of Noah through whom, in the biblical account, all post-flood humanity descends. A different name, a name that appears in the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5, in the line of Cain, in a verse that Christian readers of the King James translation have stumbled past for 4 centuries without quite hearing what it says. Hollis does not name the name in the letter. He says only that Kaplan named it, and that he, Hollis, recognized it, and that he understood at that moment why Kaplan had asked to be sent home. Because if the inscription was what Kaplan said it was, the chamber beneath es-Sultan was not the tomb of an unknown population. It was the recorded burial of a named lineage, a lineage the Hebrew Bible itself names. A lineage the Hebrew Bible itself says was wiped out in the flood, and then, in a verse most readers do not stop on, says, was also on the earth afterward. This is Genesis 6:4, the verse the title of this script names. The verse that, on a careful reading, says something almost no popular treatment of it acknowledges. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Hebrew word is Nephilim, Nanpilium. The traditional etymology derives it from the root naphal, to fall, the fallen, or those who fall, or those who cause to fall. The Septuagint, the Greek translation produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ, translators who were native readers of Hebrew, working closer to the original linguistic context than any modern scholar can claim, chose for this word a single Greek term, gigantes, giants. They did not hedge, they did not gloss, they did not transliterate, they translated, and they translated it as giants, and the Greek-speaking Jewish and early Christian world read it that way for 1,000 years. The verse contains a phrase that does not get the attention it deserves. And also afterward, the Hebrew name is Vegam Acharechen. It is not a marginal gloss. It is in the main text in every manuscript tradition, in the Masoretic and the Samaritan and the Dead Sea. Scrolls fragments. The text itself states that the Nephilim were on the earth in the days before the flood, and also after the flood. The text is internally consistent on this point. Numbers 13 reports the scouts seeing the Nephilim in Canaan. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 describe them by their regional names: the Emim, the Zamzumim, the Anakim, the Rephaim. Joshua 11 records driving the Anakim out of the hill country, including a town called Anab, 40 miles south of Jericho, in the same campaign that destroyed the city Garstang excavated and Hollis returned to. The biblical authors, whoever they were, are not mythologizing in these passages. They are reporting. They name towns. They give measurements: Og's bed, 9 cubits by 4. They cite public artifacts. They write the way the Ministry of Supply clerk wrote when he logged the Hollis crate, with dates and dimensions and the names of places a reader could go and check. This is what Hollis understood, and what Kaplan understood, and what neither of them said aloud inside the chamber. The chamber beneath es-Sultan was not an anomaly that contradicted the biblical record. It was an artifact that confirmed a reading of the biblical record that the modern academy had quietly agreed not to entertain. The verse said the Nephilim were there. The chamber said the Nephilim were there. The 11 biers, the meteoritic blade, the bilateral supernumerary molars, the femora that ran 12 to 15 centimeters past the population mean, these were not things that disprove Genesis. They were things that read Genesis the way Genesis reads itself. The last 3 pages of the letter are not archaeology. They are a man at the end of his life trying to explain a choice. Hollis writes that he had been offered, in October of 1944, on his return to London, a private interview in a room in Whitehall with 2 men he does not name. The men told him that the loss of the crate was regrettable, that the ministry's incident report would stand, and that he would find his future cooperation reflected in the continued availability of his teaching post and his pension. He understood what was being offered and what was being withheld. He took the post. He kept the pension. He did not write the paper. He writes on the 13th page that he believed for many years he had made the prudent choice. He writes on the 14th that he no longer believes this. The final paragraph of the letter is a single sentence. Voss read it once in 1971 and once again in 1990 before he made the photocopy. He has said in the one interview he gave on the subject that the sentence is the reason he did not publish the letter, and the reason he eventually sent the copy to Edinburgh, and the reason he has not slept a full night since the 2nd of July, 1971. The sentence reads, "They were on the earth in those days, and also after that. The book told us where to look. We stopped listening because we were afraid of what we would find, and we were right to be afraid, and we were wrong to stop." Edmund Hollis died 5 days after sealing the letter. He is buried in a small churchyard outside Oxford. The headstone gives his dates and his name and nothing else. The chamber beneath es-Sultan has not been reopened. The eastern slope of the Tell sits today within the boundaries of the modern city of Jericho, in a political jurisdiction where archaeological access requires permits from authorities who have, since 1967, not issued any for excavation in that quadrant of the site. Garstang's marginal note remains in the Palestine Exploration Fund archive in Marylebone. The ministry ledger remains at Kew. The Lake Delavan remains are still missing. The Lovelock sandals are still in Carson City. Jim Vieira's 1,500 articles are still scanned and indexed and waiting for someone to read them as a single document. And the verse is still there in the 6th chapter of the first book of the Bible, in every translation, in every manuscript tradition, in every pew Bible, in every empty chapel on every Sunday morning, saying what it has always said to anyone who will read it the way the Alexandria translators read it, the way Mendel Kaplan read it, the way Edmund Hollis read it on his deathbed and finally wrote down. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward.